The Secrets of Negotiation. Master the psychology, strategy, and art of getting what you want. Written and published by Rising Audiobook. Introduction. Every day you negotiate, whether you realize it or not. You negotiate your salary, your time, your boundaries, your relationships, your opportunities, and sometimes your own worth. But there is a difference between simply negotiating and negotiating like a leader. A leader does not enter a negotiation desperate to win. A leader enters prepared, composed, and clear about what matters. They know when to speak, when to listen, when to remain silent, and when to walk away. They don't need to dominate the room because they understand something more powerful. True influence begins with self-control. You may have the better argument and still lose. You may have the better offer and still receive less. Why? Because negotiation is rarely just about facts. It is about psychology, perception, emotion, timing, leverage, and human behavior. In this audiobook, you will discover the hidden principles behind powerful negotiations. You will learn how to control your emotions, recognize what others truly want, frame conversations, use silence strategically, create value, protect your position, and remain calm when everything is at stake. Most importantly, you will learn how to negotiate without sacrificing your dignity. Because the goal is not merely to get what you want. The goal is to become the person who knows how to ask for it, how to earn it, and when to walk away. Chapter 1. Master yourself before you negotiate. Before you ever negotiate with another person, you negotiate with yourself. You negotiate with your fear when you wonder whether you should ask for more. You negotiate with your ego when someone challenges your position. You negotiate with your impatience when the conversation moves slower than you want. And you negotiate with your insecurity when a small voice inside you whispers, "Maybe I should just accept what they are offering." These private negotiations often determine the outcome of the public one. A person can have excellent arguments, valuable skills, and strong preparation, yet still walk away from the table with less than they deserved. Not because the other person was smarter, but because their emotions took control. This is why the first secret of negotiation is not a clever phrase, a powerful tactic, or an impressive strategy. It is self-mastery. When you cannot control yourself, you become easier to control. Imagine someone entering a salary negotiation already convinced that their employer might reject them. They begin speaking too quickly. They explain themselves too much. They apologize for asking. Then, before the employer even responds, they soften their request. "I was hoping for a little increase, but I understand if that's difficult." The negotiation has barely begun, yet the person has already negotiated against themselves. Now imagine another person in the same situation. They have prepared their achievements, understood their market value, considered possible objections, and decided what they genuinely need. They speak calmly. They listen carefully. They don't become defensive when challenged. They don't need to act aggressive. They simply remain grounded. That is what emotional control looks like in negotiation. You do not need to eliminate fear. You need to prevent fear from making your decisions. Fear can make you accept too quickly. Anger can make you demand too much. Excitement can make you reveal information prematurely. Pride can make you reject a reasonable compromise simply because you don't want to appear weak. The strongest negotiator is not the person who feels nothing. It is the person who can feel everything and still choose wisely. This requires learning to pause. A pause gives you something incredibly valuable. Space between what happens and how you respond. Someone makes an aggressive demand. Pause. Someone criticizes your proposal. Pause. Someone offers less than you expected. Pause. Someone tells you that this is their final offer. Pause. That moment of silence can protect you from an emotional reaction that you may later regret. Leaders understand this instinctively. They don't allow every emotional trigger to dictate their behavior. They understand that composure communicates strength. But self-mastery is not only about controlling emotions, it is also about controlling your ego. Ego wants to prove that you are right. Negotiation asks you to discover what works. Those are not always the same thing. You may be completely convinced that your position is correct, yet insisting on proving it could destroy an otherwise valuable agreement. A mature negotiator knows the difference between winning an argument and achieving an objective. Ask yourself, what am I actually trying to accomplish? That question can change everything. If your goal is to secure a better salary, humiliating the person across the table accomplishes nothing. If your goal is to close a business deal, proving that you are smarter than the other side accomplishes nothing. If your goal is to protect a relationship, forcing someone to admit they were wrong may actually move you further away from what you want. Negotiation becomes easier when your ego stops demanding victory and your mind starts pursuing outcomes. Another form of self-mastery is resisting the need to be liked. Many people give away negotiating power because they fear disappointing others. They accept unfavorable terms because they don't want to appear difficult. They avoid asking for more because they don't want to seem greedy. They say yes because saying no feels uncomfortable. But being respectful does not mean being submissive. You can be kind and still be firm. You can listen without surrendering your position. You can disagree without becoming disrespectful. And you can say no without becoming hostile. That is the balance of leadership. Before an important negotiation, prepare not only your arguments, but also your emotional boundaries. Know what you want. Know what matters most. Know what you are willing to compromise on. And know what you are not willing to sacrifice. Preparation creates calm because uncertainty becomes easier to manage when you have already thought through your options. Remember, confidence does not mean believing you will get everything you ask for. Confidence means knowing that you can handle the answer, even when the answer is no. That mindset changes your presence. You stop pleading. You stop rushing. You stop over-explaining. You start listening. You start thinking. You start choosing, and that is when you begin to negotiate like a leader. The greatest negotiation advantage you can develop is not a trick you use against another person. It is the ability to remain steady when your emotions are telling you to react. Master yourself first, because once you can control fear without denying it, control ego without suppressing your confidence, and control impatience without losing your purpose, you become much harder to pressure, and when you cannot be easily pressured, you can finally negotiate from a position of clarity. The conversation across the table may still be difficult. The stakes may still be high. The other person may still say no, but you will no longer be negotiating from fear. You will be negotiating from strength. Chapter 2. Know what you bring to the table. Before you ask someone to give you more, you must understand what you already bring to the table. Many people enter negotiations focused entirely on what they want. They think about the higher salary, the lower price, the better contract, the larger opportunity, or the more favorable terms. But they rarely stop to ask a more important question. Why should the other person agree to give it to me? That question changes everything. Confidence in negotiation does not come from demanding more. It comes from understanding your value clearly enough that you don't need to exaggerate it, apologize for it, or depend on someone else to define it for you. Your value can take many forms. It may come from your skills, experience, knowledge, relationships, reputation, resources, results, time, reliability, or ability to solve problems. Sometimes your greatest asset is something the other person cannot easily replace. The key is to recognize it before you enter the conversation. Imagine two employees asking for the same raise. The first employee says, "I work really hard and I think I deserve more money." The second employee says, "Over the past year, I took responsibility for 3 additional projects, improved the reporting process, helped reduce delays, and consistently delivered my work ahead of schedule. I'd like to discuss adjusting my compensation to reflect the contribution I'm making." Both employees may work equally hard, but the second employee understands how to communicate value. The difference is not confidence alone, it is evidence. When you understand what you bring to the table, you stop making your negotiation about personal need and start making it about meaningful contribution. This principle applies far beyond salary. If you are negotiating with a client, know what problem you solve. If you are negotiating with a business partner, know what resources or opportunities you provide. If you are negotiating a purchase, know what alternatives you have. If you are negotiating a job offer, understand the skills and experience that make you valuable. And if you are negotiating a personal boundary, understand why that boundary matters to you. The clearer you are about your value, the less likely you are to negotiate from insecurity. But knowing your strengths is only half of the equation. You must also know your limits. Every negotiation becomes dangerous when you enter it without knowing what you are unwilling to accept. Before the conversation begins, decide where your line is. What price is too low? What workload is too high? What condition would make the agreement unacceptable? What behavior will you not tolerate? What are you willing to compromise on, and what must remain protected? If you don't answer these questions before the negotiation, you may answer them emotionally in the middle of it. And pressure is a terrible time to discover your boundaries. A skilled negotiator prepares both sides of the equation. They know what they want, but they also know what they will do if they don't get it. This creates something extremely powerful: independence. When you believe you have only one option, every negotiation feels dangerous. But when you know you have alternatives, your mindset changes. You become less desperate. You listen more carefully. You can reject unreasonable terms. You can ask better questions. And you can remain calm when the other person applies pressure. This is why preparation creates confidence. Confidence is not the belief that you will definitely get everything you want. It is the belief that you will be able to handle the outcome, whatever it may be. There is also an important distinction between humility and undervaluing yourself. Humility means recognizing that you are not perfect and that other people have valuable perspectives. Undervaluing yourself means ignoring your contribution simply because you are afraid of appearing arrogant. You can be respectful without making yourself smaller. You can appreciate someone else's position without abandoning your own. You can acknowledge your weaknesses without forgetting your strengths, and you can ask for more without believing that you are entitled to everything. Strong negotiators don't need to constantly announce their worth. They demonstrate it. Think about a professional who walks into a meeting and immediately begins explaining why they need more money. They talk about rising expenses, personal responsibilities, or how difficult things have become. Those things may be real, but they don't necessarily explain why the other side should agree. Now imagine someone who enters the same conversation prepared with results, responsibilities, achievements, expertise, and a clear understanding of the value they provide. The second person has something far more powerful than a demand. They have a case. That is the mindset you should carry into every negotiation. Don't simply ask, "What do I want?" Ask, "What do I bring?" Don't only ask, "What will they give me?" Ask, "What can they gain by working with me?" And don't only ask, "What happens if they say no?" Ask, "What alternatives do I have?" The answers to these questions create a foundation of strength. Because the strongest position in a negotiation is not believing that you deserve everything. It is knowing exactly what you are worth, knowing exactly what you can offer, knowing exactly what you will accept, and knowing exactly what you will do if the agreement doesn't meet your standards. When you understand your value, you don't have to chase approval, you don't have to become aggressive, you don't have to speak louder, you simply become clearer. And clarity is one of the most powerful forms of confidence. Know what you bring to the table, know what you will protect, know what you can offer, and never negotiate against yourself by accepting less simply because you forgot your own value. Chapter 3. Listen until they reveal what they truly want. In negotiation, the person who talks the most often feels like the person in control. But control does not always belong to the person speaking. Sometimes it belongs to the person listening. Every negotiation contains information. The other person is constantly revealing what matters to them through their words, questions, hesitation, objections, priorities, and even their silence. The problem is that most people are too busy preparing their next argument to notice. They hear a sentence, but they don't hear the meaning behind it. They listen to respond instead of listening to understand, and that can become an expensive mistake. Imagine you are buying a car. The seller tells you, "I need this price because this is already a great deal." Your immediate reaction might be to argue, "You're asking too much. I found a cheaper one somewhere else. That's not worth the price." But none of those responses tells you anything new. Instead, you could ask a simple question: what matters most to you in closing this deal today? Now the conversation changes. Perhaps the seller needs to complete the sale before the end of the month. Perhaps they are trying to reach a sales target. Perhaps they have another vehicle arriving and need this one moved quickly. Suddenly, you have information. The price may not have changed yet, but your understanding of the negotiation has. And information creates possibilities. This is why powerful negotiators listen beyond words. People rarely communicate only through what they explicitly say. They reveal priorities through what they repeat. They reveal concerns through hesitation. They reveal urgency through the questions they ask. They reveal flexibility through the subjects they're willing to discuss. A person might say, "The price is non-negotiable," but perhaps price isn't the only thing that matters to them. They may care about timing. They may care about payment structure. They may care about certainty. They may care about reputation. They may care about keeping a relationship intact. They may care about avoiding additional work. The stated position is not always the real need. And this is one of the most important lessons in negotiation. Positions tell you what someone says they want. Interests help you understand why they want it. Consider two business owners negotiating a contract. One says, "We need a 12-month agreement." The other immediately responds, "We're not willing to commit for 12 months. Now they appear stuck. But what if the first business doesn't actually care about the 12-month number? What if they need predictable revenue? What if they want assurance that the partnership will continue? What if they are worried about investing resources into a client who might leave after 3 months? Once the underlying concern is discovered, the negotiation becomes much more flexible. Perhaps a 6-month contract with a renewal commitment solves the problem. Perhaps a shorter contract with an early termination fee creates enough security. Perhaps both sides can agree to performance milestones. The negotiation was never really about 12 months. It was about certainty. This is why questions are so powerful. A demand gives information away. A question gathers it. Instead of immediately challenging someone's position, ask what created it. What makes that important to you? How did you arrive at that number? What would make this agreement work for you? What concerns you most about this proposal? If we solved that issue, what else would matter? These questions are not tricks. They are tools for understanding. And when people feel genuinely understood, they often become more open. Think about your own conversations. When someone interrupts you repeatedly, you become defensive. When someone dismisses your concerns, you become less willing to cooperate. But when someone listens carefully and demonstrates that they understand what you are saying, your resistance often decreases. You feel heard. That emotional shift can change the entire negotiation. Listening, therefore, is not passive. It is active engagement. You are paying attention to the words, but also to the priorities behind them. You are noticing contradictions. You are identifying patterns. You are allowing the other person to explain themselves before you decide how to respond. And sometimes the most valuable information appears when you stop talking. People often continue speaking when they feel there is space to do so. After you ask a thoughtful question, don't immediately rescue them from the silence. Give them time. They may clarify their position. They may reveal a concern they had not mentioned before. They may even offer information you would never have discovered by arguing. This is especially important when someone makes an extreme statement. Suppose a client says, "We can only pay half of your proposed fee." You could immediately defend your price. Or you could ask, "What is driving that budget?" The answer might reveal that their budget is genuinely limited. Or it might reveal that they have simply set an initial anchor. You don't know until you ask. This is where emotional discipline from the first chapter becomes essential. If your ego is demanding that you prove yourself, you will want to speak. If fear is telling you that you might lose the deal, you may become eager to compromise. If impatience is controlling you, you may rush toward a conclusion. But if you remain calm, you can stay curious. And curiosity is powerful. The goal is not to interrogate the other person. The goal is to understand the world from their perspective. Ask yourself, what are they trying to protect? What are they trying to avoid? What do they value most? What pressure might they be facing? What would make them feel comfortable saying yes? And what are they not saying directly? The more accurately you answer these questions, the better you can construct an agreement that works for both sides. But there is another advantage to listening. It prevents you from solving the wrong problem. Many negotiations become difficult because both sides spend their energy fighting over a surface issue. They argue about price when the real issue is timing. They argue about responsibility when the real issue is trust. They argue about contract length when the real issue is security. They argue about authority when the real issue is recognition. If you discover the real problem, you may discover that the solution is easier than expected. That is the hidden power of listening. You are not simply waiting for your turn to speak. You are searching for the information that makes agreement possible. The strongest negotiators don't enter conversations desperate to prove that they are right. They enter with questions, they listen, they observe, they remain patient, and they allow the other person to reveal what truly matters. Because once you understand what someone genuinely needs, you no longer have to fight blindly against their position. You can negotiate with understanding, and understanding is often the beginning of influence. Listen carefully enough, and people will tell you what they want. Listen deeply enough, and they may reveal what they truly need. And when you understand the difference, you stop negotiating against a position and start negotiating with the person behind it. Chapter 4. Control the frame. Control the outcome. Before people decide what to accept, they often decide how they interpret the situation. The same offer can feel generous or disappointing, reasonable or unreasonable, depending on the way it is presented. This is the hidden power of framing in negotiation. Whoever helps define what the conversation is really about can often influence how the other person evaluates the choices in front of them. Imagine an employee asking for a higher salary. If the conversation begins with, "I need more money because my expenses have increased," the discussion is immediately framed around personal financial need. The employer may sympathize, but sympathy does not necessarily create a reason for the company to increase compensation. Now imagine the same employee says, "Based on the additional responsibilities I've taken on and the results I've delivered, I'd like to discuss adjusting my compensation to reflect my contribution." The request has not changed, but the frame has. The conversation is now about professional value. This is why strong negotiators don't automatically accept the assumptions introduced by the other side. They listen carefully, but they also examine the frame surrounding the conversation. If someone says, "This is already the lowest price we can offer," don't immediately assume the negotiation is only about price. If someone says, "You need to decide today," don't automatically accept that urgency as a fact. If someone says, "This is the only reasonable option," ask yourself whether there are other possibilities that have simply not been discussed. A frame is essentially the lens through which a negotiation is viewed. If the other person defines the conversation entirely around price, you may end up fighting over numbers without examining everything else that matters. If they define the conversation around urgency, you may make a decision faster than you should. If they define it around fairness, you may spend your time defending yourself instead of exploring what both sides actually need. The goal is not to manipulate people. It is to make sure the conversation is based on a complete understanding of the situation rather than an assumption that benefits only one side. A strong frame makes your proposal easier to understand because it connects your request to a meaningful reason. Consider a freelancer negotiating with a potential client. The client says, "Another freelancer offered to do this for half your price." If the freelancer accepts the frame that the entire negotiation is about price, they may immediately start lowering their fee. But they could instead say, "Price is certainly one factor. The more important question is what level of quality, reliability, and support you need from the project." Now the conversation has expanded. The freelancer has introduced other dimensions of value that may matter to the client. This is the difference between positions and possibilities. Positions tell you where someone currently stands. Possibilities ask what else could be created. Suppose a company wants a lower price from a supplier while the supplier wants a longer-term commitment. If both sides frame the negotiation as a simple argument over price, they may reach a deadlock. But if they reframe the problem as an exchange of priorities, new possibilities appear. Perhaps the supplier can offer a better rate in exchange for a longer contract. Perhaps the buyer can commit to a larger order. Perhaps payment terms can be adjusted. The negotiation becomes less about defeating the other side and more about designing an agreement. This is why questions can be powerful tools for changing the frame. Instead of asking, "How can I convince them to accept my price?" ask, "What would make this agreement valuable for both of us?" Instead of asking, "How do I defend my position?" ask, "What problem are we actually trying to solve?" Instead of accepting, "This is impossible," ask, "What part of this is difficult and what alternatives could address it?" These questions shift the conversation from confrontation to problem solving. But controlling the frame does not mean controlling the other person. There is a major difference between influence and manipulation. Manipulation attempts to hide information, exploit weakness, or create a false perception. Ethical framing does the opposite. It highlights the relevant facts and presents the proposal in a way that helps both sides understand its value. Imagine someone selling a used business. They could say, "I'm selling because I don't want to deal with this anymore." That statement may be honest, but it can create unnecessary doubts about the business. A more useful frame might be, "The business has established customers, consistent operations, and room for expansion, but I'm ready to pursue a different opportunity." The facts have not been distorted. They have simply been organized around the value of the opportunity. The way you frame a negotiation also affects how you perceive it yourself. If you tell yourself, "I have to convince them to give me what I want," you may enter the conversation feeling dependent. But if you think, "We are exploring whether we can create an agreement that works for both sides," your mindset becomes more balanced. You are no longer begging for approval. You are evaluating possibilities. This matters because your internal frame influences your behavior. A person who believes they have no alternatives will behave differently from someone who believes they have choices. A person who sees disagreement as rejection will react differently from someone who sees disagreement as information. The next time you enter a negotiation, pay attention to the language being used. What assumptions are being presented as facts? What issues are being emphasized? What possibilities are being ignored? What would happen if the conversation were viewed from a different angle? Then ask yourself what the negotiation is really about. Maybe it isn't about price. Maybe it is about value. Maybe it isn't about winning. Maybe it is about solving a problem. Maybe it isn't about who is right. Maybe it is about discovering what both sides need. When you learn to recognize and shape the frame, you gain a powerful advantage. You stop being trapped inside someone else's definition of the problem. You can introduce new possibilities, clarify value, and guide the conversation toward outcomes that make sense for everyone involved. The strongest negotiators don't simply argue within the frame they are given. They understand the frame, question it when necessary, and create a better one. Because when you influence how the situation is understood, you influence how the choices inside that situation are evaluated. And sometimes, changing the way people see the negotiation is more powerful than changing the offer itself. Chapter 5. Let silence speak for you. There is a moment in almost every negotiation when people become uncomfortable with silence. Someone makes an offer, asks a question, or presents a proposal, and suddenly the room becomes quiet. Most people feel an immediate urge to fill that silence. They start explaining, they add another argument, they soften their position. Sometimes, without realizing it, they give away information or make a concession they never intended to make. A skilled negotiator learns to resist that urge. Silence can feel uncomfortable, but discomfort is not the same thing as weakness. In many situations, silence creates something valuable: space. It gives both people time to think, process information, and decide what comes next. When you become comfortable with silence, you no longer feel pressured to control every second of the conversation. Imagine that you are negotiating your salary. You explain the results you have delivered, the responsibilities you have taken on, and the compensation you believe reflects your contribution. Then you make your request. I'd like to discuss increasing my salary to reflect the value I'm providing. Your manager becomes quiet. This is where many people make a mistake. They panic. They say, "But I'm flexible," or "I understand if that's too much," or "Maybe we could consider something slightly lower." The other person hasn't rejected the proposal. They haven't even responded, yet the silence has caused the employee to negotiate against themselves. Sometimes the strongest response after making an offer is no response at all. You simply wait. Silence gives the other person responsibility for the next move. They may accept, they may reject, they may ask a question, they may make a counteroffer. Whatever happens, you receive information without unnecessarily giving anything away. This requires emotional control. If you are uncomfortable with silence, you will try to escape it. And the desire to escape can make you talk too much. People often reveal more when they are nervous. They explain why they want something. They disclose their limits. They justify their position. They sometimes weaken their own argument simply because they feel the conversation has become too quiet. You do not need to fill every empty space with words. Listen to the silence. Sometimes it tells you that the other person is thinking. Sometimes it tells you that they are uncertain. Sometimes it tells you that they are waiting to see whether you will change your position. And sometimes it tells you nothing at all. The important point is that you don't have to interpret silence as rejection. This is especially useful when someone makes an offer. Suppose a potential client offers you a fee that is lower than what you expected. Instead of immediately explaining why your price is higher, you calmly state your counteroffer and stop talking. The client may say, "That's more than we were planning to spend." You could immediately reduce your price. But instead, you might ask, "What budget were you working with?" Then listen. Perhaps they reveal that their budget is flexible. Perhaps they explain a concern about the scope of the project. Perhaps they have a fixed limit. You cannot know until you allow them to speak. Silence can also help separate real objections from automatic reactions. People sometimes reject proposals instinctively. They may say, "That's too expensive," because that is their natural first response. If you immediately defend your price, you may create a debate before understanding what they actually mean. Instead, pause and ask, "What makes it feel too expensive?" Now you are exploring the objection rather than fighting it. The same principle applies when someone pressures you for an immediate answer. Silence gives you permission to slow down. Imagine someone says, "This is our final offer. You need to decide right now." You don't have to respond immediately. You can take a breath. You can review the terms. You can think about your alternatives. You can say, "I'd like a moment to consider that." There is nothing weak about taking time to think. In fact, rushing is often more dangerous than silence. A person who cannot tolerate silence becomes easier to pressure. A person who can sit calmly through uncertainty becomes harder to manipulate. But silence should never be treated as a cheap trick. The goal is not to create awkwardness or intimidate the other person. The goal is to create room for thoughtful communication. There is a difference between strategic silence and uncomfortable silence. Strategic silence is intentional. You make your point, then give the other person room to respond. Uncomfortable silence happens when you are afraid of what comes next. The more prepared you are, the easier it becomes to use silence naturally. Know what you want. Know your limits. Know what you are willing to trade. Know what you will do if the other person says no. When you have that clarity, you don't need to rush to protect yourself with unnecessary words. Silence also improves your ability to listen. If you are constantly thinking about what to say next, you are not fully hearing the person in front of you. But when you become comfortable with pauses, you can pay attention to what is actually being communicated. Sometimes the most important sentence comes after a pause. Someone may hesitate and then reveal a concern. A manager may reconsider an offer. A client may mention a constraint. A seller may suddenly become flexible. You create the opportunity for these moments simply by allowing the conversation to breathe. The next time you negotiate, notice what happens when you stop trying to control every silence. Make your point clearly. Ask your question. Present your offer, then wait. Don't apologize for your position. Don't immediately lower your request. Don't explain something that was never questioned. Let the other person respond. Silence is not an absence of communication. Sometimes it is the space where the most important communication happens. When you stop fearing silence, you stop being controlled by the need to speak. And when you can remain calm without filling every empty moment, you give yourself something powerful in negotiation. Time to think, space to listen, and the freedom to let the other person make the next move. Chapter 6. Create value before you ask for more. The strongest negotiations do not begin with the question, "How much can I get?" They begin with a more powerful question, "What can we create together?" This shift in thinking can completely change the direction of a negotiation. When two people focus only on dividing what already exists, every gain for one side can feel like a loss for the other. But when they look for ways to create additional value, the negotiation can become an opportunity for both sides to benefit. This is one of the most important differences between a weak negotiation and a sophisticated one. A weak negotiator sees only the obvious issue. A sophisticated negotiator looks underneath it. They understand that price may not be the only thing that matters. Time, flexibility, certainty, quantity, convenience, risk, payment terms, service, relationships, and future opportunities can all have value. The more dimensions you discover, the more possibilities you create. Imagine a business partnership where one company wants a lower price while the other company wants a longer contract. At first, the situation seems simple. One side wants to pay less. The other side wants more commitment. If both sides focus only on price, the negotiation can become a battle. The buyer argues that the current price is too high. The supplier argues that lowering the price would reduce its profit. Eventually, both sides may become frustrated. But what happens if they look at their priorities differently? The buyer may value a lower price more than a short contract. The supplier may value a longer, Commitment more than receiving the highest possible price. Suddenly, an opportunity appears. The buyer could offer a longer contract in exchange for a better rate. The supplier could reduce the price because the longer commitment provides greater certainty. Neither side simply gives something away. They exchange something they value differently. That is the essence of creating value. Every negotiation contains differences between what matters most to one person and what matters most to another. These differences are not always obstacles. They can become opportunities. Something that costs you very little may be extremely valuable to the other side. Something the other person can provide easily may be highly valuable to you. The challenge is discovering those differences. Consider a freelancer negotiating with a client. The client may want a lower project fee, but perhaps what they truly care about is having the project completed quickly. The freelancer may not want to reduce the fee, but may have flexibility with the delivery schedule. Instead of simply cutting the price, the freelancer could offer faster delivery in exchange for keeping the original rate. The client receives something valuable while the freelancer protects their financial position. The negotiation becomes more creative because both sides stop treating the original demand as the only possible solution. This is why you should never assume that the first issue mentioned is the entire negotiation. If someone says, "We need a lower price," ask yourself what else they might value. Do they need faster delivery? Do they need greater reliability? Do they need flexible payment terms? Do they want additional support? Do they need a longer warranty? Do they want reduced risk? Do they need certainty that you will remain available? The answer could reveal opportunities that were invisible at the beginning. Creating value also requires understanding the difference between your cost and their value. Something may be inexpensive for you to provide, but extremely valuable to the other person. If you identify that difference, you can offer it without sacrificing something that matters deeply to you. For example, imagine a consultant working with a company. The company wants additional meetings each month. For the consultant, one additional meeting may require very little effort. But for the client, those meetings could provide reassurance, guidance, and faster decision-making. Instead of immediately negotiating over the consulting fee, the consultant could structure additional support as part of a broader agreement. The goal is not to give everything away. The goal is to discover what can be exchanged intelligently. This is where negotiation becomes more than persuasion. It becomes problem-solving. Strong negotiators constantly ask, "What does the other person value?" But they also ask, "What do I value?" These questions matter because value is rarely identical on both sides. Suppose one person cares deeply about receiving payment immediately, while the other cares more about paying over several months. A payment structure can potentially satisfy both. One person gains flexibility, while the other gains greater certainty. The solution does not necessarily require either side to completely surrender. The same principle can apply to employment negotiations. An employee may want higher compensation, while the employer may have limited flexibility in salary. Instead of treating salary as the only negotiable issue, both sides could explore additional responsibilities, performance bonuses, flexible working arrangements, professional development, vacation time, or future compensation reviews. Not every option will be appropriate in every situation, but the lesson is important. When one door appears closed, don't assume the entire negotiation is over. Look for another door. This approach also prevents unnecessary conflict. When people believe there is only one thing to divide, they naturally become defensive. Every concession feels painful. Every request feels like a threat. But when both sides begin searching for additional sources of value, the conversation becomes more collaborative. That does not mean you should become overly generous. Creating value does not mean forgetting your own interests. In fact, it makes protecting your interests easier because you are no longer relying on a single issue. You have more variables to work with. But there is an important second stage. Creating value is only half of negotiation. Once additional value has been created, you still need to negotiate how that value will be divided. This is where many people make another mistake. They become so focused on being cooperative that they forget to protect their own share. They create a better solution and then accept whatever the other side offers. Don't do that. If you helped create additional value, you deserve to negotiate fairly for your portion of it. Imagine two companies discover a new partnership structure that could increase their combined revenue significantly. The fact that they created a bigger opportunity does not automatically determine how the benefits should be divided. They still need to discuss responsibilities, investment, risk, resources, and returns. Creating value should make the negotiation better for both sides, but it should not eliminate the need for careful negotiation. This is why the strongest negotiators understand both sides of the process. First, expand the possibilities. Then, protect your interests. First, create the larger pie. Then, negotiate your share. This mindset changes the emotional tone of negotiation. Instead of entering the conversation, thinking, how do I get more from them? You begin thinking, how can we create something worth more to both of us? That question often produces better solutions. It encourages curiosity. It encourages flexibility. It encourages cooperation without requiring weakness. And most importantly, it moves the negotiation away from a simple battle over positions. The next time you negotiate, don't immediately focus on what must be sacrificed. Look for what can be added. Search for differences in priorities. Explore time, terms, services, commitments, quantities, responsibilities, and future opportunities. Ask what costs you little but matters greatly to them. Ask what matters greatly to you but may cost them little. Then look for an exchange, because the best negotiator is not always the person who takes the largest piece. Sometimes the smartest negotiator is the person who recognizes that the pie can become larger before anyone decides how to divide it. Chapter 7. Never give more than you must. One of the easiest ways to lose power in a negotiation is to give something away before you know whether you actually need to give it. Many people believe that being cooperative means making concessions quickly. They lower the price, offer additional benefits, accept unfavorable conditions, or soften their position simply because they want the conversation to move forward. But generosity without strategy can quietly become weakness. A concession should never be automatic. When you give something away, you are communicating that it has value. If you reduce your price, extend a deadline, add a service, change a condition, or accept a responsibility, you are giving the other person something that matters. If you do this too easily, the other person may begin to believe that there is still more available. This is why strong negotiators protect their position. Imagine you are selling a service for $1,000 and the potential client immediately says, "That's too expensive. Can you do it for $800? If you instantly respond, "Sure, I can do $800, you have learned almost nothing. You don't know whether $900 would have been accepted. You don't know whether the client was simply testing your flexibility. You don't know whether price was actually their biggest concern. You simply gave away $200 without receiving anything in return. A better approach is to slow down and understand the request. You might ask, what would need to change for $1,000 to work for you? Now you are gathering information. Perhaps the client wants a smaller scope. Perhaps they have a strict budget. Perhaps they need faster delivery. Perhaps they are simply trying to negotiate. The important point is that you don't reduce your position before understanding the problem. This principle becomes even more important when you make concessions. A concession should communicate that something meaningful has been exchanged. If you give something, You should know what you are getting in return. Imagine a supplier agrees to lower its price. Instead of simply saying yes to the lower price, the supplier could ask for a larger order or a longer-term commitment. The buyer receives a better price, while the supplier receives something valuable in return. Now the concession has meaning. It is not surrender. It is an exchange. This is one of the fundamental habits of effective negotiation. Trade instead of simply giving. If the other person asks for something, consider what you could reasonably request in return. If they want a lower price, perhaps they can commit to a larger quantity. If they want faster delivery, perhaps they can provide faster payment. If they want additional work, perhaps the contract needs to be adjusted. If they want greater flexibility, perhaps you need greater certainty somewhere else. This does not mean every request requires a demand. Some situations call for genuine generosity. But in important negotiations, you should understand the value of what you are giving. Another common mistake is negotiating against yourself. This happens when you reduce your own offer before the other person has rejected it. Imagine you ask for a salary increase of $5,000 per year and immediately say, "But I'd be willing to accept $3,000 if that's too much." Your manager didn't ask you to reduce the request. You did it yourself. You have given away negotiating space without receiving anything in return. The same thing happens when people make statements such as, "I'm asking for $2,000, but I'm flexible," or "I would prefer a 12-month contract, but I could probably accept 6 months." Sometimes flexibility is appropriate, but revealing all your flexibility at the beginning removes uncertainty from the other side. They now know your limits before they have offered anything in return. A stronger negotiator keeps some room for discussion. That doesn't mean being deceptive. It means recognizing that negotiation requires movement from both sides. You should also pay attention to the size and frequency of concessions. Suppose you are negotiating with someone who repeatedly asks for small improvements. First, they ask for a lower price. Then they request faster delivery. Then they ask for additional support. Then they ask for more favorable payment terms. Each request may seem small by itself, but together they can completely change the value of the agreement. This is why you must keep track of what you are giving. Don't allow a series of small concessions to become a major sacrifice simply because each individual request seemed harmless. You can calmly say, "We've already adjusted the price and delivery schedule. If we make another change, I'd like to discuss what we can adjust on the other side." That sentence changes the dynamic. You are not refusing to cooperate. You are reminding the other person that cooperation must work both ways. There is also a psychological reason concessions should be handled carefully. People often value something more when they know it was not easy to obtain. If you give something instantly, it may not be appreciated. The other person may even assume that you had plenty of room to give. But when a concession is presented thoughtfully, its value becomes clearer. For example, instead of saying, "Fine, I'll lower the price," you might say, "I can make some movement on the price if we can agree to a longer commitment." Now, the change has a reason. It communicates that you are willing to work toward an agreement, but you are not simply giving away value. This also protects your credibility. A negotiator who constantly changes their position can appear uncertain. If your price moves dramatically every time the other person pushes back, they may wonder what your original number meant. Consistency creates trust. That doesn't mean you can never change your position. It means your changes should have logic behind them. You should know why you are moving. You should know what you are receiving. And you should know where you will stop. The most important question before making a concession is simple. What am I getting in return? Sometimes the answer may be money. Sometimes it may be time. Sometimes it may be commitment, certainty, volume, access, flexibility, or reduced risk. And sometimes the answer may be nothing. If you are about to give something valuable and there is no meaningful benefit on the other side, pause. Ask whether the concession is actually necessary. Remember that negotiation is not about refusing every request. It is about making deliberate decisions. Be generous when generosity creates value. Be flexible when flexibility helps the agreement. But never give simply because you are afraid the other person will walk away. Your goal is not to prove that you are easy to work with. Your goal is to create an agreement that respects the value of both sides. Protect your position. Make your concessions meaningful. Trade instead of simply giving. And never negotiate against yourself. Because every time you give something away without needing to, you teach the other side that they can ask for more. The strongest negotiators understand that saying yes has a price. They know what they are willing to give, what they expect in return, and where they will draw the line. They don't fear compromise. They simply refuse to confuse compromise with surrender. And that distinction can protect everything you worked to bring to the table. Chapter 8. Stay calm when everything is at stake. Pressure reveals the difference between knowing how to negotiate and actually knowing how to negotiate. It is easy to remain calm when everything is going your way. The real test comes when the other person becomes aggressive, the deadline suddenly gets shorter, the stakes become larger, or you begin to believe that one wrong decision could cost you everything. In those moments, your ability to stay calm can become one of your greatest advantages. Imagine you are negotiating an important business contract. You have spent weeks preparing, and both sides are close to reaching an agreement. Then the other person suddenly says, "This is our final offer. You have 5 minutes to accept." Your heart starts beating faster. You begin wondering whether you are about to lose the entire opportunity. The natural instinct is to respond immediately because the other person has created a sense of urgency. But urgency is not the same as importance. Something can be urgent without requiring an immediate decision. The fact that someone wants an answer quickly does not automatically mean you should give one. When pressure increases, slow yourself down. Take a breath. Review what matters. Think about your alternatives. Ask whether the deadline is real, then decide. This simple process can protect you from making decisions that you will regret later. Emotional pressure comes in many forms. Sometimes it appears as anger. Someone raises their voice and expects you to become defensive. Sometimes it appears as intimidation. Someone tries to make you feel inexperienced or powerless. Sometimes it appears as urgency. Someone insists that you must decide immediately. And sometimes it appears as fear when you become convinced that losing this particular opportunity would be disastrous. Each form of pressure can distort your judgment. The problem is not that pressure exists. Negotiations naturally involve uncertainty and disagreement. The problem begins when pressure becomes stronger than your ability to think clearly. A calm negotiator does not pretend that pressure isn't happening. They recognize it without allowing it to control their decisions. Suppose a seller tells you, "If you don't agree to this price today, someone else will buy it." You might immediately feel that you are running out of options, but instead of reacting emotionally, ask yourself a simple question. What happens if I walk away? Maybe you lose the opportunity. Maybe another buyer really is interested, or maybe the statement is simply a tactic designed to make you act before you have considered the deal properly. You don't need to accuse the other person of manipulating you. You simply need to remain capable of making your own decision. Calmness gives you that ability. This is why preparation matters so much. When you know your priorities, your limits, and your alternatives, pressure becomes easier to handle. You don't have to invent your decision in the middle of a stressful conversation. You already know what matters. Imagine negotiating a job offer. The company tells you that they need an answer by the end of the day. If you desperately need the job, the pressure may feel overwhelming. You might accept immediately without reviewing the salary, benefits, workload, responsibilities, or future opportunities. But preparation gives you a different response. You can say, "I appreciate the offer. I'd like some time to review the details before making a final decision." That sentence is simple, but it protects your ability to think. You are not rejecting the opportunity. You are refusing to let pressure make the decision for you. Another important skill is separating facts from emotions. Under pressure, your mind can create stories that feel like facts. You might think, "If I don't accept this, I'll never get another opportunity." But how do you know that? You might think, "They are angry, so they must be unwilling to negotiate." But anger does not necessarily mean the conversation is over. You might think, "If I challenge this offer, they will walk away." Again, you don't know until you test the assumption. Calmness allows you to question your own conclusions. Instead of thinking, "This is my only chance," ask, "What alternatives do I actually have?" Instead of thinking, "They will never move," ask, "What happens if I ask?" Instead of thinking, "I have to decide now," ask, "What information do I still need?" These questions create mental space, and mental space creates better decisions. Calmness also changes how the other person experiences you. When someone expects you to react emotionally and you remain composed, the dynamic changes. They may realize that intimidation will not easily move you. They may become more willing to explain their position. They may even slow themselves down. You don't need to dominate the conversation. You simply need to remain steady. This is particularly important when the other person becomes angry. Your first instinct may be to match their energy. They raise their voice, so you raise yours. They become aggressive, so you become aggressive. Within seconds, the negotiation becomes a competition of emotions. But anger rarely creates clarity. If the other person becomes emotional, lower your intensity rather than increasing it. Speak slowly. Ask questions. Focus on the issue rather than the personality. You might say, "I understand that this is important to you. Let's look at the terms and see what we can actually change." You are not surrendering. You are refusing to let emotion take control of the conversation. There is also strength in knowing when to pause completely. If a negotiation becomes too emotionally charged, you can ask for time. You can suggest continuing the conversation later. You can step away, review the information, and return with a clearer mind. A pause is not defeat. Sometimes it is the most rational move available. Remember that the person who remains calm can see options that an emotional negotiator cannot see. When fear takes over, possibilities disappear. When anger takes over, compromise feels like weakness. When urgency takes over, every alternative seems invisible. Calmness brings those alternatives back into view. You begin to notice what can be changed, what can be traded, what can be delayed, what can be rejected, and what actually matters. That is why staying calm is not merely a personality trait, it is a negotiation skill. The next time you find yourself under pressure, don't ask, "How do I get out of this feeling?" Ask, "What is this pressure trying to make me do?" That question can reveal whether you are being rushed, intimidated, emotionally triggered, or simply confronted with a genuinely important decision. Then slow down. Think clearly. Return to your priorities. Review your alternatives, and make the decision intentionally. Because when everything is at stake, losing control of yourself is one of the most expensive mistakes you can make. The strongest negotiator is not the person who never feels pressure. It is the person who can feel pressure without allowing it to make the decision. Stay calm, stay clear, And remember that the moment you regain control of your emotions, you regain control of your choices. Chapter 9. Never let desperation make your decisions. The moment you believe you must have a particular deal, you risk giving away your power. Desperation changes the way you think, the way you speak, and the way you respond to pressure. It makes one opportunity appear like the only opportunity. And when you believe there is no alternative, you become willing to accept terms you would normally reject. This is why desperation can be so dangerous in negotiation. Imagine that you desperately need a job. After weeks of searching, you finally receive an offer. The salary is lower than you expected, the responsibilities are greater than you anticipated, and the benefits are not particularly attractive. But instead of evaluating the offer objectively, your mind immediately says, "I have to accept this. I don't know when another opportunity will come." That thought can control the entire negotiation. You may hesitate to ask questions because you are afraid of losing the offer. You may avoid negotiating because you don't want to appear difficult. You may accept unfavorable conditions simply because having something feels safer than having nothing. The problem is not that you need the job. The problem is allowing that need to make the decision for you. Desperation creates emotional attachment. You stop looking at the deal as one possibility among many and start looking at it as your only chance. Once that happens, your judgment becomes less objective. You begin protecting the deal instead of protecting yourself. The solution is not to pretend that you don't care. The solution is to build alternatives. Alternatives create freedom. If you have only one potential employer, that employer has more leverage over you. If you have several opportunities, your dependence on any single offer decreases. The same principle applies to business, purchasing, partnerships, contracts, and almost every other negotiation. The more alternatives you have, the easier it becomes to say no. And sometimes the ability to say no is what gives your yes meaning. Think about buying a house. If you become emotionally attached to one particular property, you may start overlooking problems. You notice the beautiful rooms, imagine your future there, and convince yourself that you cannot find anything similar. When the seller raises the price or introduces unfavorable conditions, you may accept them simply because you don't want to lose the house. But if you have researched other properties and know what alternatives exist, your thinking changes. You can appreciate the opportunity without becoming dependent on it. That distinction is powerful. You want the deal, but you don't need that specific deal at any cost. The same principle applies when negotiating with clients. A freelancer who has only one potential client may feel pressured to accept almost any terms. A freelancer with several prospects can evaluate the opportunity more calmly. They can negotiate scope, payment, deadlines, and responsibilities without feeling that every disagreement could destroy their income. Alternatives don't guarantee a better outcome, but they reduce desperation. And reducing desperation improves judgment. Another danger of desperation is that it can make you ignore warning signs. When you want something badly enough, you may explain away problems that should make you pause. You might tell yourself, "It will probably get better," or "I'll deal with that later," or "At least I have an opportunity." But a bad agreement does not become a good agreement simply because you wanted it badly. Sometimes losing the deal is better than winning the wrong deal. This is why you must decide your limits before emotions become intense. Know what you are willing to accept. Know what you are unwilling to accept. Know which conditions are negotiable and which ones would make the agreement damaging. Then, when pressure appears, you have something to return to. You can ask yourself, if I were not afraid of losing this opportunity, would I still accept these terms? That question can expose desperation immediately. If your answer is no, you have learned something important. You should also remember that no deal is a legitimate outcome. Many people treat the failure to reach an agreement as if it automatically means they lost. But sometimes refusing a bad agreement is a victory. Walking away can protect your money, your time, your reputation, your relationships, or your future opportunities. The fear of no deal often makes people accept deals they later regret. Imagine negotiating a business contract where the other side offers attractive financial terms but demands conditions that would severely limit your future. You may feel tempted to accept because the money looks impressive. But if the agreement creates long-term problems, the immediate gain may not be worth the cost. A strong negotiator looks beyond the excitement of the present moment. They ask what the decision will mean 6 months from now, 1 year from now, 5 years from now. Desperation focuses on immediate relief. Wisdom considers long-term consequences. This does not mean you should reject every imperfect offer. Every agreement involves compromise. The goal is to distinguish between reasonable compromise and decisions made from fear. Before accepting an important deal, ask yourself a few simple questions. Am I choosing this because it is genuinely good for me, or because I am afraid I won't get anything else? What alternatives do I have? What happens if I walk away? What am I sacrificing to get this? And would I still accept these terms if I felt completely secure? These questions can restore perspective. The strongest negotiators understand that their power does not come only from what they can obtain. It also comes from what they are willing to refuse. When you know you can walk away, you become less reactive. When you know you have alternatives, you become less desperate. When you become less desperate, you can listen more carefully, think more clearly, and negotiate more confidently. Never allow your emotional attachment to one outcome to become stronger than your commitment to your own interests. Want the opportunity. Work for the opportunity. Negotiate for the opportunity. But never convince yourself that you must have it at any price. Because the moment you believe you have no choice, you begin surrendering choices. And the strongest position in negotiation often begins with a simple belief. I would like this deal, but I am willing to walk away if it costs me more than it is worth. Chapter 10. Protect your worth until the very end. A negotiation is not finished simply because someone says yes. In fact, some of the most important moments happen after both sides believe they have reached an agreement. The excitement of reaching common ground can make people careless. They become eager to finish, stop paying attention to details, and begin giving away things they had previously decided to protect. This is why a strong negotiator remains careful until the very end. Imagine that you have spent hours negotiating a business contract. After several rounds of discussion, the other side finally agrees to your price. You feel relieved. The hardest part seems to be over. Then they casually mention one additional condition. They want a slightly longer payment period. Because you are already celebrating the agreement, you accept without thinking carefully. That small condition may seem insignificant, but repeated concessions at the end of a negotiation can change the value of the entire agreement. Reaching common ground does not mean you should stop thinking. It means you should think even more carefully. When people become emotionally attached to the feeling of agreement, they sometimes become afraid of reopening difficult subjects. They tell themselves, "We're almost done. I don't want to create another problem." That fear can make them accept terms they would have rejected earlier. But protecting your interests is not creating a problem. It is completing the negotiation properly. One of the first things to remember is that price is only one part of an agreement. People often spend most of their energy negotiating the headline number while overlooking everything surrounding it. Payment schedules, deadlines, responsibilities, warranties, cancellation terms, exclusivity, support, deliverables, penalties, future adjustments, and other conditions can have enormous value. A lower price may not actually be a better deal if the surrounding conditions create greater costs later. Imagine you negotiate a consulting contract and successfully reduce the fee. You feel like you have won. But then you discover that the agreement requires unlimited revisions, weekend availability, and immediate responses to every request. The lower price may have been meaningless because you accepted a much larger workload. This is why you must look at the entire agreement rather than celebrating one favorable term. Ask yourself, what am I actually agreeing to? Read the details. Clarify the responsibilities. Confirm the deadlines. Review the payment terms. Understand what happens if circumstances change. And make sure the final agreement matches what you thought you negotiated. This becomes especially important when the other side introduces a last-minute request. Last-minute concessions can be powerful because they arrive when your emotional resistance is at its lowest. You have invested time, energy, and attention into reaching an agreement. You may feel that saying no to one final request could cause everything to collapse. But the fact that you are close to agreement does not mean you should give something away automatically. If the other person asks for an additional concession, pause and evaluate it just as carefully as you would have at the beginning. Ask why it is necessary. Ask what it is worth. Ask what you would receive in return. And most importantly, ask whether you are accepting it because it makes sense or simply because you want the negotiation to end. There is nothing wrong with making a final adjustment when it creates a fair agreement. The problem is making one out of fear. This is also why you should avoid becoming careless after hearing the words, "We have a deal." A verbal agreement may create excitement, but the details still matter. A misunderstanding about one term can create conflict later. What one person believes was agreed upon may be very different from what the other person believes. Clarity protects relationships. If something matters, make sure it is clearly understood. If a responsibility was discussed, confirm who is responsible. If a deadline was agreed upon, confirm the date. If a payment condition matters, make sure it is clearly defined. Good negotiation does not end with vague assumptions. It ends with clarity. There is another important principle. Never sacrifice your core values simply because you are close to the finish line. Perhaps the other person asks you to accept something that makes you uncomfortable. Perhaps the agreement requires you to compromise a principle that matters deeply to you. Perhaps you realize that the financial reward is attractive, but the long-term consequences are not. This is where knowing your worth becomes important. Your worth is not determined only by the amount of money attached to the agreement. Your time has value, your reputation has value, your peace of mind has value, your relationships have value, your principles have value, and sometimes protecting those things is more important than completing the deal. A negotiation should produce an agreement you can live with, not merely an agreement you can announce. This is why you should never be afraid to pause at the end and review everything. Ask yourself, if I looked at this agreement without the excitement of reaching it, would I still consider it fair? That question removes some of the emotional noise. You may discover that the agreement is excellent. You may discover that one detail needs clarification, or you may discover that you accepted something you shouldn't have. The important thing is that you notice before it becomes a problem. Walking away from an almost finished negotiation may feel painful, but sometimes it is necessary. The amount of time you have already invested should not force you to accept a bad outcome. Time already spent is gone. Your future is still in front of you. Protecting your worth means understanding that a deal is only successful if the final terms respect what matters to you. Don't become careless because someone said yes. Don't give away another concession simply because you are tired. Don't ignore important details because you are excited. And don't abandon your principles because the finish line is close. Review the agreement. Protect the terms that matter. Question last-minute requests. Clarify what remains uncertain. And make sure the final result reflects the value you brought to the table. The strongest negotiators know that winning is not simply reaching agreement. Winning is reaching an agreement that still looks like a good decision after the excitement disappears. Because the negotiation doesn't truly end when someone says yes. It ends when you can walk away from the table knowing exactly what you agreed to, why you agreed to it, and why you are comfortable standing behind it. Chapter 11. Know when to fight and when to walk away. Not every negotiation deserves to be won. Sometimes the strongest decision you can make is to stop negotiating altogether. There are moments when continuing to fight for a deal only causes you to sacrifice more of your time, money, principles, or future than the agreement is worth. Knowing when to continue and when to walk away is one of the clearest signs that you truly understand your own value. Many people struggle with this because they see walking away as failure. They believe that if they cannot reach an agreement, they have lost. But that is not always true. Sometimes refusing a bad agreement is a greater victory than accepting a profitable-looking deal that creates long-term problems. Imagine that you are selling a business. A buyer approaches you with an attractive offer. The financial amount looks impressive, and at first everything seems promising. But as negotiations continue, the buyer demands conditions that would limit your future, interfere with your long-term plans, and force you to accept responsibilities you never intended to keep. You now have a choice. You can continue negotiating because you are afraid of losing the buyer, or you can recognize that the agreement no longer serves your interests. This is where self-respect becomes part of negotiation. Before entering an important negotiation, you should know your non-negotiables. These are the conditions you are unwilling to sacrifice simply to reach an agreement. They may involve money, time, responsibilities, ethics, ownership, relationships, or long-term goals. Your non-negotiables give you a boundary to return to when emotions become intense. Without clear boundaries, the pressure of the moment can make you accept almost anything. You might think, "I've already spent so much time on this." Or, "What if I don't find another opportunity?" Or, "Maybe I should just accept it and deal with the consequences later." These thoughts can keep you trapped in a negotiation that should have ended. The time you have already invested does not make a bad agreement better. It only makes you more emotionally attached to finishing it. This is why you must separate persistence from stubbornness. Persistence means continuing when the opportunity is still valuable and a reasonable agreement remains possible. Stubbornness means continuing simply because you don't want to admit that the deal is no longer worth pursuing. There is a major difference between the two. A skilled negotiator knows when more effort can create a better outcome and when more effort will only increase the cost. This is where alternatives become powerful. If you have no alternatives, walking away can feel impossible. But if you have other opportunities, options, or strategies available, you are less dependent on any single agreement. You can evaluate the deal based on its actual value rather than your fear of losing it. Think about a job offer that looks attractive at first but requires you to accept conditions that conflict with your long-term goals. You could keep negotiating because the salary is good. You could tell yourself that the problems will eventually disappear. But if the fundamental terms are incompatible with what you want from your career, continuing to negotiate may not solve the real issue. Sometimes there is no better version of the wrong deal. You need a different deal, and sometimes you need no deal at all. Walking away does not require anger. In fact, the best walk-away decisions are often calm. You don't need to insult the other person. You don't need to prove that they are unreasonable. You don't need to make the moment dramatic. You can simply say, "I appreciate the opportunity, but these terms don't work for me." That is enough. A calm exit protects your dignity and keeps the relationship intact when possible. The other person may even return later with better terms because they recognize that you are serious about your boundaries. But walking away should not be used as a theatrical threat. If you repeatedly say, "I'll walk away," without actually being willing to do it, you weaken your credibility. The other person eventually learns that your threat has no meaning. Only use your willingness to walk away when it is genuine. There is also an important distinction between fighting for value and fighting for ego. Sometimes people continue negotiating because they cannot tolerate the idea of losing. They become obsessed with proving that they can get the other person to agree. The negotiation becomes personal. That is dangerous. You might spend hours trying to win a small concession simply because you don't want the other person to feel that they defeated you. But what are you really winning? If you spend more time and energy than the concession is worth, you have not won. You have simply satisfied your ego. The goal of negotiation is not to defeat another person. The goal is to protect your interests and create the best possible outcome. This is why you should constantly evaluate the value of continuing. Ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve? How much is this agreement actually worth? What am I giving up to reach it? Are the remaining issues negotiable? Have I reached my limits? What alternatives do I have? And if we never reach an agreement, what happens next? These questions bring you back to reality. They help you distinguish between an opportunity worth pursuing and an agreement that has become too expensive. You should also recognize that walking away can sometimes improve your negotiating position, even when you don't intend to return. When the other side knows that you are genuinely willing to leave, they understand that pressure has limits. They cannot assume that you will accept anything simply because you have already invested time in the conversation. Your willingness to walk away protects the meaning of your decisions. It tells yourself, as much as the other person, that your boundaries are real. But remember that walking away is not always the right answer. Negotiation requires compromise. Not every unfavorable term is a reason to leave. Sometimes a small sacrifice creates a much greater benefit. Sometimes relationships matter more than maximizing every individual term. Sometimes flexibility today creates opportunities tomorrow. The skill is knowing the difference. Ask whether the sacrifice is temporary or permanent. Ask whether it affects something essential or something flexible. Ask whether the other person is also making meaningful compromises. And ask whether the final agreement still supports your larger goals. A good negotiator does not walk away at the first sign of resistance. They listen, they explore, they create value, they make reasonable trades, they remain patient. But when the terms cross a meaningful boundary, they recognize the moment. They stop fighting for the deal and start protecting their future. That is not weakness. That is judgment. Your ability to walk away is not about rejecting opportunities. It is about refusing to let fear determine what you accept. Sometimes the best negotiation is the one that reaches an agreement. Sometimes the best negotiation is the one that reveals a better possibility. And sometimes the best negotiation is the one that ends with you calmly standing up and leaving the table. Because there are agreements that can improve your life, and there are agreements that can quietly damage it. Know the difference. Fight when the value is worth pursuing. Compromise when compromise serves your goals, but when the price becomes greater than the value, have the courage to walk away. Chapter 12. Win the deal without losing yourself. What does it really mean to win a negotiation? For many people, winning means getting more money, paying less, getting the better terms, or making sure the other person gives in first. They measure success by what they gained and what the other side had to surrender. But true negotiation mastery requires a deeper definition of winning. A successful negotiation is not simply one where you get the most. It is one where you achieve what matters to you without sacrificing your dignity, relationships, principles, or long-term interests. You can win a deal and still lose something far more valuable. Imagine negotiating a business partnership. You manage to secure an excellent financial arrangement, but you create so much resentment that the relationship becomes impossible to maintain. On paper, you won. In reality, you may have damaged an opportunity that could have benefited you for years. A short-term victory can sometimes create a long-term loss. This is why you must look beyond the immediate outcome. Ask yourself what the agreement will mean after the negotiation is over. Will the other person still trust you? Will they want to work with you again? Will you be comfortable with the way you handled the conversation? Did you protect your interests without unnecessarily damaging theirs? These questions matter because negotiation is rarely an isolated event. Most important relationships continue after the deal is signed. A client may become a long-term partner. A colleague may become a future manager. A supplier may become an essential part of your business. A business partner may work with you for years. Even when you negotiate with someone only once, your reputation can travel beyond that conversation. This is why power should be used responsibly. Having leverage does not mean you should use it to humiliate someone. Having information does not mean you should exploit every weakness. Having the ability to pressure someone does not mean pressure is always the best strategy. Influence becomes more valuable when it creates better outcomes rather than unnecessary harm. Think about two negotiators who have equal power. One tries to dominate every discussion. They interrupt, intimidate, exaggerate, and treat every compromise as weakness. They may occasionally get favorable terms, but people will remember the experience. The other negotiator is equally confident, but approaches the conversation differently. They listen carefully, explain their priorities, remain firm when necessary, and search for solutions that work for both sides. The second negotiator may not win every individual point, but they build something more valuable: trust. Trust can become a form of long-term leverage. When people trust you, they are more willing to share information. They are more comfortable exploring possibilities. They are more likely to believe your commitments, and they may return to you for future opportunities. This is why winning does not always mean maximizing every possible advantage. Sometimes you should leave value on the table because protecting the relationship creates greater value later. That does not mean becoming weak. You should still know your worth. You should still protect your boundaries. You should still ask for what you deserve. You should still walk away when the terms violate what matters most to you. Integrity does not require surrender. It requires knowing the difference between confidence and domination. A confident negotiator can say no without insulting someone. They can disagree without creating hostility. They can push for better terms without making the other person feel worthless. They can use leverage without abusing it. And they can accept a compromise without believing they have lost. This mindset changes the meaning of negotiation. You are no longer trying to prove that you are smarter than the other person. You are trying to create an agreement that allows both sides to move forward with clarity. That is especially important when the relationship matters. Imagine negotiating with a close business partner over responsibilities. You could insist on getting exactly what you want because you have stronger leverage in that particular moment. But if the agreement creates resentment, future cooperation may become difficult. A better approach may be to find a solution that both sides consider fair, even if neither side gets everything. That is not failure. That is strategic thinking. The ultimate goal is not to become someone who always gets the last word. It is to become someone who can remain confident without needing to prove superiority. This is the deeper form of negotiation mastery. You know what you want. You understand what the other person needs. You can listen without losing your position. You can create value without giving away your worth. You can make concessions without surrendering your principles. You can remain calm when pressure increases. You can recognize desperation before it controls you. You can protect the final agreement, and when necessary, you can walk away. All of these skills lead to one final principle: negotiate without losing yourself. Because there will always be moments when getting what you want comes with a hidden price. Maybe you have to damage a relationship. Maybe you have to compromise a principle. Maybe you have to sacrifice your peace. Maybe you have to become someone you don't respect simply to get the outcome you wanted. When that happens, ask yourself whether the victory is still worth having. Money can be recovered. Opportunities can return. Deals can be renegotiated. But your reputation, character, and self-respect can be much harder to rebuild once they have been repeatedly sacrificed. The best negotiator understands this. They don't measure every conversation by how much they extracted. They measure it by whether they created a worthwhile outcome while remaining true to themselves. That is what makes negotiation a life skill rather than merely a business skill. Every difficult conversation gives you a choice. You can react emotionally or respond intentionally. You can fight over positions or search for possibilities. You can give away value or trade intelligently. You can accept pressure or remain calm. You can cling desperately to one outcome or recognize your alternatives. And you can win at any cost, or you can win without becoming someone you don't want to be. True negotiation mastery is not about controlling other people. It is about controlling yourself well enough to influence outcomes without abandoning your values. So when you sit across from someone in your next important negotiation, remember what this journey has taught you. Know yourself. Know your value. Listen deeply. Control the frame. Respect silence. Create value. Protect your position. Stay calm. Never negotiate from desperation. Protect your worth until the end. Know when to walk away, and above all, remember what the deal is supposed to serve. Your goals, your future, your relationships, your principles, your life. Because the greatest negotiator is not the person who defeats everyone at the table. It is the person who can stand at the table with confidence, negotiate with clarity, create value with integrity, and walk away from the conversation knowing they achieved something worthwhile without losing themselves in the process. That is what it truly means to win.